Welcome back to an episode of the Open Source Cafe. And recently, we've been talking a lot about security, and we talk about like Kubernetes in general, and talk about the entire field in DevOps. And even at KubeCon, it was a big buzz about like security around stuff. And today we have Marco here with us. Marco, thanks a lot for joining us today. Really appreciate you giving the time. I know it's late in New York right now, so I appreciate you
Uh,
taking time to be on this session. Before we move forward, would you like to tell our viewers a little bit more about yourself?
yeah, sure. And thank you, Kunal, for having me. Hi, everyone. I'm Marco Campana. I'm a solutions engineer at Teleport. And it is 10:30 p.m.-ish in New York City. But if you know New York, then you know it's early for this part of New York. The night is just getting started. And yeah, I've been with Teleport for about 8 months. And previous to that, I worked for various investment banks, helping modernize their infrastructure to be more secure as well. Thanks for having
Yeah,
me.
the city that never sleeps.
Yes,
Nice.
exactly.
Cool. And today, before we move on to the topic of discussion, which is we talk. So by the way, we're talking all about authorization and stuff. Can you tell us a little bit more about, like in brief, what teleport is?
Yeah, sure. So Teleport is the easiest way to access all your infrastructure in a very seamless, unified approach, but with also tighter security and auditing, right? We call Teleport an access plane. So what Teleport does is enable you to use your single sign-on provider to be that source of truth, and then use a short-lived certificate uh, RBAC mapping model to access pieces of infrastructure that would generally need, SSH keys, username and password for DB, right? Teleport helps remove that vulnerability from your infrastructure access and helps uh, sort of integrate single sign-on, but also make it easier for your developers to use single sign-on as well.
Yeah. And if you want to learn more about Teleport, I've done a video on it already, and more to come. So check out the links in the description below. But today we're talking about some of the authorization best practices and learning from your experiences, things that you have seen,
Mm-hmm.
that folks work with. But before we move on to that, can you tell us a little bit more about some of the common vulnerabilities that you have seen when it comes to authorization, and then we can maybe talk about how you can use some of the best practices to you know prevent those vulnerabilities.
Yeah, sure. So when it comes to the most common vulnerabilities I've seen in the authorization world, I would say it's just a lack of organization with your user mapping and whatever identity provider you're using to manage the permissions and policies that your users have within your organization. So, for instance, users resources at your company will switch groups, they'll get promoted, they'll move on to other companies, but their user ID or their attribute to, let's say, their user email will still be configured in that access policy potentially within your identity management provider. And then this leaves a huge vulnerability to your organization if, say, a former employee wants to have access to that. If you don't have that automatic adjustable policy based off who's active in your group and based off their job function, there could leave a huge open uh, arena for a surface area attack if those policies are not consistently managed and configured to the least privilege model to secure your organization.
In addition to emails, when we talk about resources, you know,
Mm-hmm.
um, so it should not be available as an anonymous user. You should not have unprotected
Exactly.
resources as well, and not exploit that. That's also one of the vulnerabilities. What about
Yes.
when we talk about um, privileges, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. So for privileges, what you will see is if anyone needs elevated privileges, if your method of granting those escalated or elevated privileges is static, it's not ephemeral. If you would just generate a SSH key that has availability to access your prod servers, your prod Linux servers, rather than just your dev test environment, and that key has a long time to live or a permanent time to live if it's not if the PAM module in your SSH server is not reconfigured, your resource will always be able to access that escalated privileges that you provisioned for them. So a key method to address that, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, is ensuring that those escalated privileges, if needed, are short-lived and they're only provisioned as a need to basis, not a permanent, you may need this, so have that access at all times. No, you want to keep that short-lived and rotation configurable at all times.
Yeah. And I believe Teleport as an open source access plane, it also offers the privilege access management, so you can
Yeah.
learn more about it from there as well. Cool. So that's like a good an overview, like some of the common like vulnerabilities. Speaking from your experience, like how do folks detect this? Like, are there any scenarios? I mean, you may have seen that these go undetected, for example. So what is the approach that you have seen folks take? Like, how did you find about these? I mean, you work at Teleports, obviously that makes sense, but um,
Right.
for general folks and companies and security researchers, how can they make sure that such vulnerabilities are not like and more like this are not like you know
Yeah,
skipped,
absolutely.
undetected.
There's always, depending on the cloud provider you're using, depending on the identity provider, there's an array of microservices available, like CloudWatch, like Teleport, for example, where you can audit log your infrastructure, who's accessing it, set up alerting and monitoring with a SIM tool. But these are all, after the fact. If they're already authorized to access this infrastructure, these logs will showcase to you who has permissions to, conduct root commands, for example, or just a high probability of, other administrative commands. But at that point, it might be too late. So what you want to do is, best practice is always to continuously audit your infrastructure, but also a practice is to review your policies, right? Review what policies you have enabled at your organization, and then against that, what groups are inheriting those policies that may have elevated privileges in your infrastructure, right? So a big common vulnerability is that your microservices, you're built out so much, you're using all these tools, your cloud is scaling so fast, and you're not reviewing which IAM roles, for example, have certain policies mapped to them, and that could be a huge red flag. So I would say best practice would be enable the logging so you can start seeing everything that's happening in your infrastructure. And then after that, do fine-grained reviews of your policy structure to ensure that the right IAM roles and user groups are mapped to those permitted policies.
Yes, thanks for sharing. And you mentioned about cloud providers. So we take an example of, like, for example, AWS, right?
Sure.
So you mentioned about policies and roles. So definitely you can use the AWS's the access management to create roles. But
Right.
the thing is that when we talk about policies in AWS, they have so many services. Like, you check out their dashboard and they have a lot of stuff going on. I think more than a
Yes.
hundred or something services are there that AWS provides. So how do you make sure, like, if there are more than 100 services, so there can be
Mm-hmm.
so many combinations in order to create just a few specific roles. So how do you
Right.
make sure that these are not like misconfigured over the time or whatever?
Yeah. So what you can do with Teleport, for example, is enable the usage of an additional RBAC mapping to your user groups. So say your AWS is scaled to the point where it would be a huge lift to review all 200 policies you have created for the hundreds of users that you have on top of the hundreds of microservices. Well, depending on the single sign-on identity provider that you're using, you can clean up your organizational policy management and RBAC with Teleport mapping to that SSO. So for instance, with Teleport, we connect to all your infrastructure in AWS through reverse tunneling and those encrypted join tokens. But then after that, we can then set up a further RBAC layer to reapply what may have gotten missed in your initial scaling of your cloud. So if a user has dev and test in your SSO group, we could take that webhook callback API from an SSO group, tie it to a teleport role that would only have access to servers with EC2 tags that say dev and test, for example. And your users wouldn't even be able to see those production Linux nodes because the teleport RBAC policy prevents them from seeing that without the EC2 tag dev or test, right? So it would completely omit pieces of infrastructure that they're not permitted to. So teleport enables this cleanup, and it gives you, our audit logs give you a lot of visibility into, what is happening in your Linux servers, not just from a CloudWatch logging perspective, but from a session recording perspective as well. So you can see the different types of access and sessions that are being conducted on a daily basis within your infrastructure.
Amazing. Thanks a lot for sharing that. Just one last pointer about vulnerabilities, and then we can move on to like the best practices, and I have some slides
Yeah, sure.
after that as well. Some of these also like have based on some particular, like policies are based on some particular criteria, like location that can be easily overridden. Like you can use a VPN or something, or types of devices or whatever. So what are your thoughts on that, and how can one prevent that? Yeah.
Yeah, so for sure. So the location VPN sensitivity can always be prevented with two things. One, you can always have an auditor permit your session on a validation standpoint. So even if someone is just trying to assume a location where they're permitted to access infrastructure with a VPN, you can enable that dual user, we call it, or dual auditor that gets that request for a session to be started with all those users' details that's attempting to access that. So if it's a VP, if say John Smith is in Europe on vacation, but you see John Smith in the USA is trying to start an SSH session, you wouldn't authorize that just off your knowledge of where your resources are versus an attempt to log in as well. You can also enable a physical MFA device like YubiKey on a per session MFA basis, or on an overall access account basis where it has to be that physical human that's attempting to access that infrastructure, and the YubiKey has to be unique to that user's, of course, laptop unique YubiKey that they've been provisioned and granted from the organization. So there's a second model where you can confirm or deny people on a per session basis, or you can ensure that it is the human behind the screen based off their unique YubiKey, for example.
Amazing. Well, thanks a lot for sharing. Hopefully that was helpful to folks. But many organizations also, they release their own set of like best practices that you can definitely follow. I'll leave some links in the description below, and I highly recommend checking out some of the teleport blogs as well that have some great information. All the resources I'll be mentioning in the description below. Cool. Now let's move on to some of the best practices and the slides that you have presented here, Marco.
Sure. So best practices I would recommend, to prevent common authorization vulnerabilities would be to try to adhere to the model of least privilege as best you can. And what do I mean by the model of least privilege? It's a principle where your developers, engineers, your resources have essentially no access at all times, and you use a workflow tool. It could be a CI/CD pipeline tool, or just any service desk tool that you have implemented in your organization. ServiceNow is a good example, where if they need to conduct any changes, any upgrades, any updates on your infrastructure, even if that's their day-to-day job, they have to submit an elevated access request into your pipeline that you can guarantee is temporary via the approval and deletion of this access request, whether that's automated through a script or that's manual. That's up to you. Automated is always preferred in case you don't want to leave room for human error in case you forget to remediate those permissions. But the access request workflow that we've instilled in Teleport, and we've seen other organizations use their own as well, is that it gives everyone visibility to what type of access is being managed and provisioned on a day-to-day basis. And it adds in that extra layer of audit and checkpoint to enable prevention of anyone using root just because they've had that elevated privilege permitted before, right? This enables you to review why they're going to need elevated privileges in your infrastructure, and it gives you the ability to make it time bound, right? Those bound on policy or bound on IAM role. How long will they need this for? You provision that. If it's a contractor for a month, then you set that certificate with Teleport for a month, for example. And if it's a new hire that's just getting started in a demo environment, but you want them to eventually move into a production role, you set that for however long you think that training window will last for that new resource. So least privilege principle via access requests and always having the baseline amount of access in your authorization policies will patch a large percentage of your vulnerabilities just because you have that implemented into your workflow. And I have some slides here to show kind of how Teleport, not only do we provision the access request capability for you, we also have developed a multiple of, web plugins with some of the more popular tools that we've seen customers use, like Jira, Slack, for example. I have Slack set up in my cluster, but also other vendors like Mattermost, PagerDuty as well, GitLab, or it's a customizable web API too. So if you just want it to be sent to your email when someone needs access with a unique link to Teleport to go back and approve that, you can do that as well. And then just to continue on that, Kunal, not only just the access requests, that's a good layer of auditing, but also ensure that you have an auditing agent, and if it's Kubernetes, make sure it's a, container sidecar that's auditing, all your kubectl exec calls, right? So even though let's say if you have that access request workflow implemented, you still want to have that logging and alerting tool set up that you can review everything that's happened, even with those access requests. This will enable you to see if a server goes down because you permitted John Smith to, configure a migration into a new data center. With Teleport, for example, you can have a session recording of that server's Linux session all the way up until the point where that server goes down. So not only will you be able to provision the access for John Smith, you'll also be able to see what John Smith did in case something breaks. And that way you can rule out that it was a external hacker or a third-party threat, that it was a human error within your organization. And that, I think, will cause everyone a lot less stress in the fact that there's a production server down, for example. So auditing is a key piece to that too, as well, Kunal.
And also, when we talk about implementing authorization, when should so if someone asks at what point of the software development lifecycle should you implement authorization? Do you wait as the complexity grows, or is it like right from the early stages? What do you think?
It's right from the early stages as best as you can. I understand that for dev instances, sandbox environments, real pieces of infrastructure that don't have real metadata or vulnerability to your overall, framework or footprint, for example, you still want to use authorization policies to at least classify that this role and this piece of infrastructure is a, low code or low level risk piece of infrastructure that you're accessing, right? You want to try to implement it at the lowest level, because that way, if a developer shifts organizations or shifts teams or gets promoted or needs elevated privileges, they already have the base layer of authorization policies attached to their RBAC mapping. So what they've been doing previously in your infrastructure, and you can mitigate further that they need to do something else, for example. So, but you don't want to make your developers' lives too, unfun. You want to give them the ability to create and, use that sandbox environment accordingly, but you also want to make sure that you're not leaving anything up to chance. So you start those authorization policies as early as you can and scale them as you grow with tools like Teleport or some of AWS's other microservices as well.
And when we talk about the policies,
Hmm.
so you all know about RBAC, right?
Yes.
But there's this another thing called attribute-based access control, ABAC,
Yes.
which is often recommended when we talk about software engineering. Obviously, it depends on your application, but what would you recommend, and what are your thoughts around this ABAC versus RBAC? Like which one, and what, like any comments around that?
Yeah. ABAC is good. Attribute mapping was important and is still important, but I think, as pieces of cloud computing like Kubernetes, for example, upgrade and scale with how ephemeral and how hybrid cloud all of our infrastructure is becoming. Moving to RBAC, I think, helps you have more security around your access, because a rollback mapping can have those attributes to policies rather than just attributes permissions attached to just your hard-coded username or email, right? So what we're able to do with Teleport in our SSO integration is map those attributes to roles, where we take ABAC from one of your SSO providers, for example, and assign them a role within Teleport to ensure that the attribute is more of a confirmation that you are who you say you are, rather than a permissionable credential to pass you all the way through to a key piece of infrastructure. So ABAC is good for confirming, that someone has the right user metadata, that is the right person that should be accessing your cluster, your Kubernetes cluster, for example. But RBAC further enables you to mitigate controls over who's accessing that Kubernetes cluster. So I think with Kubernetes upgrading to 1.8 or 1.7, we're moving to more of an RBAC based piece of Kubernetes orchestration, and then Teleport's following that model with our RBAC mapping.
Yeah, amazing. Well, thanks a lot for sharing. And so since we're talking about software, if someone is using the like website or whatever, and
Mm-hmm.
they've just started a session, I mean we all know that it can easily be tampered with on the client side. That's why all these, like the authorization part, authentication stuff, it happens on the server side, like
Right.
the backend. So do you have any of the best practices for that when we talk about server side, when we talk about authorization with, like, when you're working on the server side? Yeah, I just use
Yeah.
I've used JWT tokens and stuff. But if you have anything you want to
Yeah.
share.
JSON Web Tokens are great. You can also, you know, you can also enable per session MFA with tools like Teleport or other tools as well, where even though they have the RBAC uh, mapped permissions to their identity to start an SSH session, with Teleport, you're able to add that per session MFA, where they would have to hit their YubiKey or enter that 6-digit code from whatever their MFA application is to start that SSH session as well, as just an additional layer to check that as well. Or you can implement the use of a PAM module to restrict root based off which IAM policy or which Teleport role that user is assuming within your Linux server. And additionally, what you can do is you can always do depending on if you're using SSH keys or if you're using certificates like with Teleport, you can always do a certificate rotation with cert authorities like Teleport, where, if a certificate is short-lived, but maybe you provision some credentials for up to a year, a cert rotate would erase all currently living credentials in your infrastructure and provision new ones based off your RBAC model that you have instilled against your policies. So if something changed and those policies no longer apply to certain roles, for example, those credentials, those new certificates would then apply that to your entire cert authority and then almost refresh the SSH abilities your users have from a Linux perspective.
Cool. Those are all the questions I had. Do you have any additional set of best practices we may have missed out on?
Um, yeah, to state the obvious, always upgrade.
Hmm.
I'll don't obviously you can really read the release notes and see for yourself. Maybe give it a week or two just to let any new bugs be discovered with new versionings of software. That if you see that a software uh, has a bit of bug history with their new releases, but usually new releases are to mitigate those critical cyber vulnerabilities, and they're usually to patch any existential or open threats to their software on top of adding new features. So don't let it up to chance on upgrading your infrastructure. Read the release notes, and if it seems like a critical patch that can help you and your organization be more secure, go ahead and upgrade that Kubernetes cluster. Go ahead and upgrade, your Teleport cluster, for example. Upgrade your Ubuntu Linux daemon, right? Just always be updating and upgrading your infrastructure to prevent the latest vulnerability that just may be a tiny one, but if you don't upgrade, you never know. So that's the
Yeah.
obvious, Kunal, but just have to say that here to cover my bases.
Yeah. Yeah, amazing. And we covered a little bit more about it in the beginning when we were talking about privileged
Yeah,
access management as well. So I think lots to think about. We covered a bunch of things, and really appreciate you giving the time, Marco. Uh,
thank
been
you.
been a pleasure. Really had a great conversation. For everyone else, you can check out Teleport, other things that we mentioned, or everything I'll list in the description below, and we'll see you in the next one. You can connect with Marco. I can link you can
Yeah,
connect with Teleport as well.
and
And
I just started my teleport Twitter account. It's at Marco A
nice.
Campana. I tweeted about KubeCon and just some other. I wrote a blog recently on AWS console access with Teleport. It's a really neat feature where we take Teleport app access and we actually layer it on top of your AWS console, so you can even audit and use different single sign-ons to further secure even the console layer of your cloud. So I talk about that in some blogs, and yeah, follow me on Twitter. And Kunal, thank you so much for this time. It was great.
Amazing. Yeah, thanks a lot for sharing. I'll leave those in the description below. And yeah, I'll see you in the next one. Have a great day, everyone. And thanks for joining. Bye.